Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about what Oedipus can teach us about not politicizing the tragedy. Now, I'm filming this on Halloween 2023. It'll probably go up this Friday, I suppose. And so late last week was the Lewiston, Maine shooting, which was the most recent single mass shooting to really make U.S. national news. But also over this past weekend, I saw in an NPR article that there were shootings in at least half a dozen states at Halloween festivities. And so I wanted to talk about this piece of rhetoric, this talking point that always comes up after a mass shooting. And this is going to be a more political video than I tend to make for this channel. And this is going to somewhat tip my hand in terms of where I stand politically. But this is a very, very common anti-gun control talking point, that people shouldn't politicize the tragedy. That is, in the wake of a mass shooting, this is not the time to talk about potential gun control measures. It's somehow inappropriate or offensive to the memory or the families of those lost or injured, whatever it is. Don't politicize the tragedy. This is a very common refrain from gun control opponents. Right-wing political figures in the U.S. especially. And I get it. I get why the phrase is what it is, but I also think it's an interesting choice of phrase, because if we deconstruct it, following in the footsteps of Jacques Derrida, one of Derrida's great insights, the foundation of deconstruction as a mode of literary criticism is basically that the meaning of language exceeds what a speaker intends to say, that words are more multifaceted and carry additional unintended meanings. And so I think if we deconstruct this phrase, it actually is terrible advice. Now, I would argue it's terrible advice anyway. I mean, if the occurrence of a mass shooting is not a good enough reason to talk about potential gun control to stop future mass shootings, I don't know what would be. But let's take this at its word for the moment. So, what this essentially means is a bad thing has happened. Let's let it be a bad thing rather than reducing it to the level of petty politics. Now that's sort of the intended meaning of the phrase, don't politicize the tragedy. But if we start actually thinking about this in terms of tragedy itself, tragedy as such, we're led to quite a different conclusion, I think. So what do I mean by this? Well, the way that we tend to use the word tragedy today and the way that it's used in this phrase is to mean an unfortunate thing, a bad thing that has occurred. But if we think back to classical drama, where we get the term tragedy from, the origin of the word tragedoi, which comes to us from the Greek, it doesn't mean that. It's not just a bad thing has occurred. The earthquake that destroyed the Minoan civilization was a bad thing. It wasn't, for the Greeks, though, a tragedy, to the extent that the Greeks really knew that the Minoan civilization had been destroyed by an earthquake. But that's not the point. A bad thing itself was not inherently a tragedy. We'll take one the Greeks definitely knew about, the plague that hits Athens in the early portion of the Peloponnesian War. This was not a tragedy. It was a bad thing. It was a terrible thing from the Athenian perspective. A lot of people died. It severely weakened their ability to prosecute the war. It led to political paranoia, etc., etc. across the board, bad stuff from an Athenian perspective. Not a tragedy. It was a bad thing that occurred. Tragedy is much more complex in its original form. And one of the things that's important about the original form of tragedy is that it is somehow brought on by one's own actions. Hubris is the term we tend to assign, although sometimes it's less hubris and more... there's some other motives that sometimes come into play, but typically, if we take a broad view of hubris, this is the most common thing. And hubris in this case, in the case of Oedipus, which is the one we're going to be thinking about, Oedipus the king, hubris involves attempting to avoid one's fate, challenging the will of the gods or of the fates, stacking one's poor human powers up against the divine. Now, in Oedipus the King by Sophocles, we have a couple of important sets of events, or a couple of important prophecies that really lead things in the wrong direction. The first comes to Laius. Laius gets a prophecy from the oracle at Delphi, which says, if you have a son, your son will kill you. And so Laius attempts to not have any sons, but he gets drunk, has sex with his wife, they have a kid. And so Laius says, let's put a spike through that kid's feet and leave him on a mountain to die. Great plan, right? Wrong. Because a shepherd is like, oh, here's a baby with a spike through its feet. I'm going to pick this kid up and take him to the king and queen of Corinth, who don't have any kids and want one. And so Oedipus survives. So that's the first one. Laius attempts to avoid his fate, not by not having a kid, but by trying to murder his kid and failing. Then, when Oedipus is grown, when he's an adult, he gets a prophecy from the oracle at Delphi that he will kill his father and marry his mother. So, thinking that he is the child of the king and queen of Corinth, he heads out of Corinth. On the road out of Corinth, he meets a dude who he proceeds to kill in a fight. Turns out that was Laius, his actual father. Then he goes to Thebes, where he was actually born, unbeknownst to him, and through a series of events involving a sphinx and answering a riddle, Oedipus ends up marrying Jocasta, the queen of Thebes, and taking over the now vacant throne, vacant because Oedipus had killed the previous king. So, in the attempt to avoid his fate by leaving Corinth and the people he thinks are his parents, he in fact brings about the tragic events. His hubris has caused his downfall. Yeah, so this is central to tragedy in the classical sense, in the traditional sense. The origins of the word come to us from an artistic system in which one attempted to avoid negative consequences, and the attempt to avoid that negative outcome caused one's downfall. And so, in the US, some states this is not the case, but in the US as a whole, mass shootings are not a tragedy. Now again, I want to be 100% clear. I obviously don't mean that in the sense that they are not unfortunate, bad things that should not occur. They 100% are. But they aren't tragedies in this classical sense. The use of the term tragedy to describe them implies that we have somehow attempted to stop them from occurring. That we have run away from our fate. We have left Corinth in order to not kill our father and marry our mother, which in this case is to have mass shootings. But in the US, we haven't done that. We have an entire political faction with major lobbying organizations whose primary aim, or one of their primary aims, is to ensure that gun control laws are not passed, to ensure that people are angry and fearful, to ensure that people are distrustful and view other Americans or other human beings as enemies. All of this stuff. And as well, interestingly enough, because one of the other big talking points is always it's a mental health issue, to make sure that there is not funding for health services, including mental health. So this is not, we are not at the Oedipus leaves Corinth stage. That would be if we had passed gun control laws. We were doing everything we could possibly think of. We were fully funding healthcare. We had abandoned any sort of violent political rhetoric. We'd done all the stuff, all the things we could possibly do to try and decrease mass shootings, and they continued to occur. That might be a tragedy. What we have done is, rather than leave Corinth, we have gone from the Oracle at Delphi to Corinth, stabbed the guy we think is our father through the heart, thrown our mother down on the floor of the throne room, and had our way with her. That is what we have done in this instance. We have refused to do the things that should, according to the data and kind of according to common sense, mitigate these unfortunate events. So in this case, what we have is not tragedy. What we have is a system in which we have built in the likelihood of a bad thing occurring, and then some of us are still surprised when that bad thing occurs. Or maybe more accurately, some of us just don't care that that bad thing occurs. Now, obviously, there are a lot of Americans who, a lot of what we tend to call common sense gun laws are incredibly popular. If what the people of the United States wanted actually made any difference to our political system, we would have gun control laws. But we don't, because there is an entire political faction and major lobbying groups dedicated to preventing it. So that's one element of this that I think is really important, is that we don't have a tragic situation here. We have a bad situation, but it's a bad situation that we have collectively either built or allowed to be built. So that's one important thing that Oedipus can teach us about not politicizing the tragedy. But there's another. And that's the politicizing part. Because this is the other component of this rhetorical talking point. Don't politicize the tragedy. As we've seen, there isn't a tragedy. There's an unfortunate set of events. But what about politicizing? What the people who use this talking point mean is, let's not reduce the solemnity of this loss, of this unfortunate event, to mere petty politics. The problem is, tragedy is already political. And again, Oedipus the King is an amazing example of this, because where do we start out in the play? We start out with a plague afflicting Thebes. It is impacting the city, the polis in Greek. And polis gives us the word politics. We get the root word there. Politics literally means the stuff that affects the polis, the things that are of collective interest or collective concern. And any sort of event that occurs across the polis, the body politic, the nation state in this case, is already of political interest. And so when in Oedipus the King, when Oedipus goes to the people and they're like, hey man, we're getting fucking plagued here and it sucks. Oedipus is like, I will figure out what is causing this plague and I will fix it on behalf of you, the citizens of Thebes. And they're like, great, that is exactly what you should be doing. In this context, there is a plague of mass shootings in the United States. On average, I think in the past year or two, on average, we've had more than one a day. That's excessive. that is, I would say, a plague. A plague of mass shootings. Very, very common thing. And again, we have set the conditions for these things to occur through violent political rhetoric, through the easy access to guns and ammunition, through limited resources for mental health care, through the reemergence of white nationalism, fascism, Christo-fascism, etc., etc. These are political issues inherently. You can't not politicize these tragedies. The majority of mass shootings are done by people with right-wing sympathies, people who lean totalitarian, typically people who are racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, or a combination of two or more of these things. Mass shooters tend to be driven by political objectives, and they exist within a political context in which gun control is an issue that is open for debate, although realistically, again, if what the overwhelming majority of Americans wanted, there would not be that much debate about it. So the idea that you can not politicize mass shootings ignores the fact that they are pre-politicized. They are already political, both because they affect the polis, they affect the body politic, the collective of the American nation state, but also because there is a set of political conditions and political decisions that have created the context in which these occur. These are not neutrally occurring things. They don't just happen. They are driven by political decisions about gun control laws. They are driven by political rhetoric about the enemy and party loyalty and things like this. They are driven by increasingly violent political rhetoric, either explicitly or implicitly violent. And they are driven by the reemergence of fascism, white nationalism, Christo-fascism, etc., etc. And so in this sense, we see something really interesting about this rhetorical talking point of not politicizing the tragedy. It ignores that this is not tragic in the traditional sense. This is unfortunate. But if this were to genuinely be a tragedy, we would need to be trying to avert it against the will of the gods, or something like this. We would need to be trying to avert mass shootings, and that leading to more mass shootings. We don't have that. That's not the situation in the United States. And there's no element of not politicizing a tragedy. A tragedy is already political. There is a widespread negative impact on the polis. It is therefore a matter of collective interest. And again, I think Oedipus the King is an excellent example of the ways in which this talking point fundamentally misses the point of the language it's chosen.